Hello, ladies and gentlemen, gabestah here. This is the full guide for Heroic Primordius. If you're just looking for the quick guide and just need a little bit of information, check out the quick guide there by clicking the annotation that you see on the screen. So, we'll start with some raid composition stuff, talk about the differences in Heroic as usual, and then we'll get into the fight mechanics and tactics from there. So let's get started. So for your tank setup, you absolutely need 2 tanks for this encounter. The extra add type that you get on Heroic, which we'll talk about in a moment, requires that you keep it away from Primordius throughout the fight. If it gets within melee range, it will explode and wipe the raid. So you're going to need 2 tanks for this encounter. In addition, I would strongly recommend 3 healers. The amount of damage incoming to the raid throughout the fight, especially later on in the fight, if you don't have a lot of DPS, is going to be extremely high. So at the end of 7.5 minutes for us, we were looking at about 420,000 healing per second on average for the entire duration of the fight. So this means, of course, lower at the beginning when the evolution stacks aren't as high, and much higher at the end. So I would strongly recommend 3 healers, especially if you have a healer that's capable of doing some DPS at some point in the fight, where you don't really need the extra healing, and then transitioning into a more heal-focused role later on. It's also worth noting briefly that a class that can do extremely strong and continuous AE damage throughout the fight will be really useful on this encounter. So probably the biggest help would be a warlock that can just do their massive AE throughout all the bloods throughout the fight, and really just take care of that whenever you need it. A elemental shaman is also pretty good with chain lightning. A windwalker monk would probably be decent, although not quite as good as range because they'd be out of melee range of Primordius, of course, at the time. But anyway, if you have something like that available, especially the warlock with the large AE radius, then that's really going to be handy for later in the fight. So the one major addition for Heroic is Viscous Horror. These are new add types that you'll get from the pools around the room. You'll get 1 horror every 30 seconds throughout the entire fight. So they spawn frequently and in random locations. So you have to be really prepared for where they can come from at any given moment. Now the horror should be tanked by the tank that's not on Primordius at the time and kept out of melee range of Primordius, as mentioned briefly. If it gets within melee range, it will explode and kill everyone in the raid instantly. Bummer. So, while tanking the horror, in addition to doing quite heavy melee damage to the tank will gain stacks of black blood, which is a stacking debuff that lasts 1 minute and increases the damage that the tank does to Primordius by 20,000 per stack. However, this debuff also does 20,000 nature damage every 3 seconds to the tank per stack. So it's kind of a yin and yang effect where the tank is going to take more damage from the stacks but also be able to actually do more DPS on Primordius once they have to swap back to him. Probably the most important aspect to this entire encounter is the sort of back and forth ballet dance that your 2 tanks have to manage to trade off Primordius and Viscous Horror tanking duties whenever it's appropriate. Because you can't have the horrors in range of Primordius, and because they can spawn in random locations, it's really important that the current horror is dead by the time the tank needs to taunt Primordius off the current Primordius tank, lest that tank get too many stacks of malformed blood and die. So, the pattern that you develop is really, of course, up to your raid, your tank strength, your healer strength, all that stuff. But what worked best for us was every 2 horrors we would swap tanks. The reason for this is essentially that the debuff times are about 1 minute, so this allows us to essentially keep the debuffs up on the tanks for the full duration that they're doing one job or the other. Since there's 2 horrors over the course of 60 seconds, the tank that's getting the blood stack from the horror will have that last for the 60-second duration that they're on Primordius, roughly, before the previous tank swaps with them. And then at that point, they'll have the 60-second duration of malformed blood from Primordius to use on the horror and back and forth. However, swapping every 2 is, again, kind of a tricky dance. So it's really important that your tanks are well aware of the spawn locations of these bloods. So make sure their cameras are zoomed out, they're looking all around the room when one is due. And of course, being careful not to move Primordius near the pool that a blood may be coming out of. Now you'll want 1 or 2 DPS to help the tanks kill the Viscous horrors. And in our case, we used a Shadow Priest because he could sort of multi-dot, so do some damage to Primordius at the same time, as well as our Elemental Shaman, who could help focus the horrors down, and then afterward, he could also easily kill off bloods using Chain Lightning and such, if needed. So 1 or 2 DPS is probably ideal, preferably range so that melee don't have to run in and out of positions at all times. And then generally our tanks try to keep the Viscous horror kind of in the center or behind the boss, near the stacked, sets of bloods that are chasing the boss throughout the fight. This way the tank's AE damage and miscellaneous cleave could also kill some bloods here and there. The final important factor for killing the horrors is to allow your tanks to get the buff stacks. Obviously getting up to 5 stacks and being mutated doesn't really matter for horror damage, but it will give you 5 various buffs, 10% of stats or crit or whatnot, that will certainly increase their DPS a great deal. And throughout the fight, tanks should be a large portion of the overall effective damage in this fight. So allowing your tanks to get those buffs as early as possible will help if you're having trouble with the Viscous horrors. So when you actually engage Primordius and start the fight, you'll want to decide where you want to initially tank him so that the first sets of bloods can be killed off quickly to allow players to get the buff stacks. Now there are really 2 schools of thought here. Probably the most common technique is to tank Primordius in the direct center. You're probably used to this on normal. And therefore the bloods will just follow the sort of drawn paths that already exist on the floor toward the center, and players can kill them off as they come in. However, one thing that we found that worked better was to move Primordius to the doorway at the start of the fight. And basically, because we didn't have enough DPS, because we're 3 healing, and because we needed extra damage on the Viscous horrors, we don't have enough DPS to kill all 10 blood spawns at the start of the fight as they come out. We actually let the 2 nearest to Primordius, so near where he is on the door, the right and left pools, we just let those bloods get absorbed. The thinking being that because they're so close, they're probably not going to die very quickly, and you don't want to do half the DPS to one and then have it absorbed by Primordius. So we ignore those 2 pools, and that leaves 8, 4 on each side, that are further away from his starting location near the door that we can kill off pretty easily. Another minor but helpful tip is to have the tank that initially pulls Primordius actually only hold Primordius to get 1 or 2 stacks of the initial malformed blood buff. Then as soon as that first Viscous horror spawns, the other tank that wasn't tanking Primordius taunts, and this way the first tank on the Viscous horror has 20 or 40,000 extra damage being dealt to that Viscous horror right away. So that'll help just a little bit on getting that first one down, because your DPS won't really have stacks of the buffs at the start of the fight until things kind of spawn more and you get more progressed into the transitions. Another minor tip that may or may not help your raid is that we found it was useful to start kiting Primordius around the time that the first tank transition occurs. So this would be between the second and the third Viscous horror spawns. This just was around the time that the number of bloods was starting to accumulate, and we wanted to kite before he absorbed too many of them or got caught in a position where we couldn't get him out without healing. So starting to kite around then allows you to start grouping up the bloods that are behind him. And of course, by kiting, he doesn't absorb as many as he normally would. So you'll generally be able to prevent him from evolving quite as much as he would if you just kept him stationary. One big consideration for the raid before you even get started really is how you plan to distribute the buffs from the mutagenic pools created by killing bloods. So just like in normal, when you get a mutagenic pool buff, you'll gain 10% of stats or crit or whatnot. And if you get 5 stacks, you'll be transformed and able to do 100% normal damage to Primordius for 2 minutes, at which point it falls off, and then you can get a new stack of 5 and repeat the process. On Heroic, of course, because the DPS requirement is quite severe, because you have Primordius's increased health from normal, plus the Viscous horrors to deal with, and all the little bloods having more health, it can be a little bit tricky to do enough damage to get him before the Berserk. So, especially if you're 3 healing, it's really important to figure out a solid way to distribute the buffs so that it maximizes the effective DPS that you're doing to the targets that matter, namely Primordius and lesser extent the Viscous horrors. So the first big suggestion that we learned after trial and error and trying a lot of different methods is essentially the idea of prioritizing the buffs toward players that have the highest sustained damage output on Primordius. So this will depend greatly on your raid composition, the skill of your players, all that stuff. But we tried to determine which players were going to be strongest at the given roles. So who would be strongest at attacking the horrors versus who would be best left on Primordius, and how to distribute that. Once you figured that out, then you can actually volunteer people essentially not to get buff stacks as frequently or as high priority as other players. So to put that in perspective, in our raid we have 3 melee DPS, and then we have usually 3 range DPS, but in this case we have 3 healers, so it's only 2 range DPS. Because we need DPS on the horrors, and we opted for the range to be the best choice for that, this means that for most of the fight, those 2 range DPS are not able to actually directly attack Primordius. Most of the time they'll be dealing with the horrors or the little bloods, and then only after those things are taken care of can they actually attack Primordius. So because of that, we prioritize the buff stacks onto our 3 melee DPS, who are allowed to then be on Primordius full time throughout the fight. After those 3 melee DPS, then our 2 tanks are actually another high priority, and then our range DPS after the tanks, and finally our healers as well. So, it's not the kind of thing where you'll exactly take turns and say, oh, here's one, you have to come get it because you're next in line. But for the most part, if you start off in that sort of rotation, allowing a core set of people to get the first stacks, then they can quickly get started doing the effective DPS to Primordius that you'll need to meet the DPS check. Once you recognize that some DPS will not really be attacking Primordius very frequently, and therefore their buff stack, at least getting to 5, doesn't matter very much. They'll want buffs because of the stat boosts, of course, but actually getting transformed is a low priority for them. The second major tip is to utilize Bloodlust and other major cooldowns for the final 45 seconds or so of the first 5-stack applications that go out on your raid. So essentially what this means is if you have, say, 3 or 4 DPS that tend to get a 5-stack right away, and then your other DPS or your tanks don't quite get them that quickly, just because there aren't enough blood buffs available, then you'll want to wait to use Bloodlust until the last moment. So you want it to be active the full 40 seconds during all those 5 stacks, but by delaying it till the last 45 seconds or so of the first application, you just give enough chance for future people to get 5 stacks before Bloodlust is actually used. So just keep that in mind about when you're going to time your major DPS cooldowns. After that Bloodlust, of course, then players will generally want to rotate their own personal DPS cooldowns at the time that they refresh their stack or as soon as it's available after that. Pretty self-explanatory. The third tip would be to assign a designated living fluid destroyer or killer. So this player would of course just be in charge of killing the living fluid pack that's following Primordius around the kite path whenever it's appropriate. So it's going to be very helpful for this player, especially to have some indicator of the number of players that have a 5-stack active and the duration on those. So you can see kind of in the left of the screen, I have a series of WeakWars bars that show who has 5 stacks and how much time they have. And I'll provide the import link for that in the description of the video there. But suffice to say, it's very useful to have a large pack of bloods killed or just being killed when a big group of people lose their 5-stack. So they can just run over, pick them up, and get back on Primordius. So the final thing to discuss is the mutations that Primordius will gain throughout the fight. Mechanically, these work just like they do in normal. So there's 6 possible mutations, and every 100 energy, Primordius will evolve, increasing his damage throughout the rest of the fight, as well as adding a new mutation buff to his repertoire. On Heroic, however, he can have 4 mutations active at the same time. So at any given moment, once you're kind of a ways into the fight, he will always have 4 of the 6 possible buffs that he can. The good and bad news, in a way, is that for most of these, the simple solution is just heal through the damage. For the majority, there's really nothing you can do to prevent it. So you just have to manage them just like you would on normal, doing the basic mechanics. However, there's one exception on Heroic, especially that you really have to focus on. Everyone in your raid has to be very aware of and try to avoid. And that is essentially the erupting pustules that are launched out while he has that buff. So the best thing to do for pustules is to simply watch him very closely, because he does it about every 10 seconds. And when they start to fly in the air, move just a couple yards. Now, pustules don't exactly always target players, so it is possible, and it will happen at some point, where multiple pustules will land in the same location. And if a player happens to be there, they're going to just be one shot, because 2 pustules will kill you pretty much. So the best you can do is to, like I said, step just a few yards so that a pustule that was targeted right at your location doesn't hit you. And otherwise, try to watch where they're coming in. You can usually react to kind of the angle that they're flying in at and see where it is safe to stand. But because of the frequency every 10 seconds and because of the speed of the projectile itself, it's not always possible to avoid them outright. So it's best to just assume that one's going to land on your location and just step a few yards. You don't want to step too many yards to one side or the other, because you could risk stepping into someone else's pustule if they were nearby. So the radius is only 2 yards on the actual AE, so just a couple steps will be plenty to get out of it. So, believe it or not, that's pretty much all there is to it. Mechanically, Heroic Primordius is very similar to the normal version, just the addition of the horrors. So once you kind of get your tanks in the proper order and they get the pattern down, you have enough DPS assigned to the horrors without overdoing it so that you have enough damage on Primordius, and then you get your buffs distributed evenly. It's just a matter of time before you survive long enough to get him down. There is some random elements, of course, to the mutations that Primordius gains and the order that he gets them and all that. So some attempts will be easier to heal and survive than others, but just keep at it, and eventually you'll get it down if you have the basics. So that is Heroic Primordius, and as always, good luck, and thanks for watching.